about Pittsburgh's bridges, but there are so many different things that you can talk about. So I promise you tonight isn't just a rehash of presentation after presentation after presentation. So if you want to know more about Squirrel Hill bridges, bridges of Pittsburgh in general, or some of the hidden bridges in the area, those recordings are all available on the Squirrel Hill Historical Society's website. So today, the focus of this presentation is through this Engineering Pittsburgh book, which was published by the History Press, same publisher that did the Squirrel Hill history book. And this book, the book itself was written by a bunch of different civil engineers going through the history of various aspects of civil engineering. So I contributed the history of the regional bridges and the growth and development of the bridges in the state and in the area. So this presentation will not be, here's a bridge, let's talk about it. It will be more of the story of the growth and development of bridges in Western Pennsylvania. So with that, I'll go to the presentation here, and there we go. Can everyone see that? Mm-hmm. All right, great. So yeah, so as for the introduction, the Pittsburgh Bridge book that I wrote with Helen Wilson, that came out in 2015, and you've heard a few talks about that one. And then the one on the right, Engineering Pittsburgh, that one came out in 2018. So talking about the evolution of bridges in Western Pennsylvania, I mean, here we see the city of Pittsburgh, which we know and love. And all of these bridges are distinct designs at distinct places. But you think about if you go, let's go back in time, before there were any bridges here, back when this was the wilderness of the forks of the Ohio. Now, I know I mentioned this before, there will be a few repeated slides, but when did bridges first become important in Western Pennsylvania? And you can trace that back to Fort Pitt here and the town that developed around Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh. Fort Pitt was constructed in around 1760, and you can see the bridges that went into the fort. So these were probably the first bridges that were built in the city. Being the forks of the Ohio, Pittsburgh was a very important strategic place. The French had their territories in Louisiana and Quebec. So how do you go from Louisiana to Quebec? You go along the Mississippi River to the Ohio River, and at some point you need to get over to the Great Lakes. So there are various portages, one of them being along the Ohio to the Allegheny River to what George Washington called the French Creek, which is today known as French Creek, which flows into the Allegheny and Franklin. And from there, you can get pretty close to the Great Lakes to continue your water route to Quebec. Meanwhile, the British were, since the colonies were all along the East Coast, were pushing west. So Pittsburgh was naturally the intersection, and controlling the forks of the Ohio could also mean controlling the Ohio River. So once the French built Fort Duquesne to lay claim to this area, General Braddock's failed military campaign in 1755 came up along this route known as Braddock's Military Road. So this hastily constructed road from Cumberland, Maryland, up towards, not quite Pittsburgh, but towards Braddock, so close enough. So looking at the map today, it's pretty interesting that most of the route is not really used today along main roads. I mean, a portion of US 40, a portion of 119, but the connections from Connellsville to Pittsburgh really aren't as direct as they were back then. And I mean, there are certainly modern day reasons for that. So this is approximately where Braddock's Road went to Pittsburgh. Now, while there were no bridges on this route originally, they just would have forded the streams. Parts of this road did develop into important roads. So I'm going to focus a lot on this portion of today. It's US 119 between Uniontown and, it's right by Mount Pleasant, so between Uniontown and Greensburg. And that's where Jacobs Creek, it forms the county line between Westmoreland and Fayette County. And believe it or not, this bridge at Jacobs Creek is one of the most important bridges in history. But to fully tell that story, let's go back to the Revolutionary time. My common sense would tell me most of you have heard of Thomas Paine, the founding father, the revolutionary, but you probably didn't know that he was interested in bridges. In thinking about his ideals as a revolutionary and wanting to promote a free society and democracy, he believed that you could only do that is if ideas and knowledge could could move around and go from place to place. You can bring a newspaper, you can talk to people, that you can bring these ideas. So the free transport of people and goods were important. Now, in the late 1770s, the first major cast iron arch bridge was, and here's an image of it, which I did not take because even though I walked across the bridge, they were painting it at the time, so I couldn't take any good pictures of it. But which is the same thing that happened for the first concrete arch bridge. So it's always, when you photograph bridges, you always find a few that are being painted. But anyway, that bridge was built, and you can see that the bridge is a semicircle, which meant that the road had to be really high over it to have a long span. And you can see there are even some smaller approach spans that are just elevated semicircles. What Thomas Paine thought was this design is not practical for in a lot of cases because the road would have to be so high. So he believed that the arch should be more like a segment. And so he patented a concept of a segmental iron arch in 1788. And this is not his patent drawing, but this is an example of his idea for a semicircular iron arch. Now, what's really important about this particular design, and again, here's the larger image, you can see all of these little links to this arch. So Pennsylvania, we think today as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as being the urban areas. Well, back in the 1700s, not only was Philadelphia really the main urban portion of the state, but it was really the main urban portion of the country. And if you think today, would you rather drive to Philadelphia or would you rather drive to Baltimore, or Washington, D.C.? I mean, obviously Baltimore is a lot closer. And Baltimore was also a developing port along the Chesapeake. So Pittsburgh was actually starting to become more connected with Baltimore. So there were a lot of various disputes back then, and Thomas Paine realized that one of the advantages of bridge construction in the frontier is you need to be able to build something that is constructible and could be moved to rural places. So what he noted at the bottom here is by building bridges from many small parts rather than a few enormous ones, so these are the enormous parts here, bridge construction can become a more adaptable enterprise. Bars and parts of which it is composed need not be longer than is convenient to be stowed in a vessel, boat, or wagon. So when we talk about iron bridges, they really only could become successful with that strategy. Unfortunately, Thomas Paine was years ahead of his time because it was a lot easier to cut down the old growth trees and build bridges out of wood than it was to manufacture bridges. So, so iron bridge building in this area, really did not take off until, around the Civil War, if not after the Civil War. But anyway, that was this pieced together wrought iron arch bridge was his vision. And in 1786, he constructed a 13-foot model and displayed it at Ben Franklin's house. So anyone in Philadelphia at the time might have been interested in the model and could see this little model of the bridge. Eventually, he went back to England, and among the other things he did in England, one of the things is he was interested in trying to build this bridge and build a model of this bridge. He thought that, at the time, the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia was crossed by wooden pontoons, and thought that building this iron arch bridge in Philadelphia would be the ideal place to do it. But England was where there was the knowledge to work with iron, as well as the funding that would allow this model to be built. So he built this model in 1890, and he kept marketing it to Philadelphia. So had you been in Philadelphia at the time, you would have learned about this arch bridge with wrought iron links. And just one thing to note, that because he got caught up in the French Revolution, his bridge building career went nowhere. Supposedly his big model arch bridge was reincorporated into another bridge in England. And then that company that was building them just a few years later built this iron arch bridge in 1803. This is the oldest iron arch bridge in the Americas. It's not here, unfortunately, it's in Jamaica. So I would say, if we weren't dealing with the pandemic, let's all go to Jamaica and check this bridge out, because I have not seen it. Who wants to go to Jamaica, right? But again, it shows how this arch is made up of a lot of smaller pieces. So who was in Philadelphia at that time was Judge James Finley, who previously was the Fayette County Commissioner and then was elected to the State House and the State Senate. Remember, in the 1790s, not only was Philadelphia the capital of Pennsylvania, it was also the capital of the country. So it really was America's center. Philadelphia was America's foremost city, more so than New York. And I'll explain why that changed a little bit later. But anyway, one of the tasks as Fayette County Commissioners, he would have reviewed internal improvements to build roads and bridges, as understanding that the local residents would want ways of having commerce to flow. So he understood that he needed a bridge for the frontier that could be constructed easily and cheaply. And rather than thinking about wood, he was thinking about iron. Was he inspired by Thomas Paine? There's no direct research, but it's pretty hard to think otherwise. Like, how would somebody who was not schooled in engineering all of a sudden become the inventor of the suspension bridge? Quite a major accomplishment. And anyway, while in Philadelphia, you could tell that he was studying it. He wrote a paper on mathematics of suspended bridges. He studied Chinese iron chain bridges. He studied Peruvian bridges. He studied English chain bridges, which at that time did not have a hung road. So therefore, he came up with an idea to hang a level, stiffened road from catenaries made of iron chains. So if you look in this picture, you can kind of make out, this is not the Jacobs Creek Bridge. This bridge was in Massachusetts, but this is one of his chain bridges. So if you look, you can see sorry if I froze for a minute there, but you can see the iron chain. So this was his concept of a bridge. This is one of his patent drawings. This was his bridge in over the Schuylkill. But he built his very first example in 1801 and patented it in 1808. So because of that patent, we know that he had the first modern suspension bridge. So you can say all of the other suspension bridges you'd ever use, like the Golden Gate Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, they can all trace back to this very first bridge in Fayette County. And he built up to 40 of these bridges. And you can see in this image, you can see the various small iron pieces. Now, unfortunately, within a few years, his bridges started to collapse. I mean, there wasn't much redundancy in the bridge chains. So therefore, his designs, started to die out, where they were, say, rescued in England and France, where iron technology was more prevalent and more needed, because the frontier in America had way more trees than, say, more developed areas of England and France. So anyway, going back to Pittsburgh now, here's the original plan from 1784 by George Woods. This is where the Smithfield Street Bridge ended up going, and this is where the 6th Street Bridge ended up going. Now, Pittsburgh was trying to have James Finley build their first bridges. So he designed Pittsburgh's first bridges in 1810. However, 1810 was also a time with a lot of financial uncertainty and depression leading up to the War of 1812. So while the bridges were designed, they were very expensive bridges, and they were, for the time, even though they were cheap bridges, they were still very expensive bridges for the time, for their size, and they were never built. Meanwhile, Louis Warnwag designed a long span covered bridge in Philadelphia. And that bridge became the new sensation. And thanks to that bridge, as well as Thomas Palmer's permanent bridge that was built a few years before, America started to realize that covering their wooden bridges was the way to build durable, relatively long-lasting bridges in the frontier. So when Pittsburgh, was later able to start to afford to build bridges, with the Monongahela River Bridge at Smithfield in 1818, here's this wooden covered bridge, and the Allegheny River Bridge over 6th Street in 1819, they were wooden covered bridges. And they had Louis Warnwag, who was again became the most famous bridge designer of that particular era, design them. So he designed and built the bridge, the Smithfield Street Bridge, and he designed the one at 6th Street, but he didn't build it because then they wanted a bridge, because someone else wanted a bridge over the Susquehanna River, so he decided to go and build that one instead. So he designed it, but Sylvanus Lothrop was the builder of this bridge, and Lothrop ended up building other bridges, like the first bridge at 9th Street, worked on the canal that was in this area. If my mouse pointer works, you can see there was a canal in the 1830s, and Lothrop Hall at University of Pittsburgh is named after him. Now, I mentioned that Philadelphia's influence started to wane, and that was because as America was looking at ways of entering the frontier, they started developing alternative routes. So crossing the Appalachians was very difficult. So the federal government understood the need to build a road through the mountains, and so they built the Cumberland Road, also known as the National Road. The first segment built from 1811 through, or it was built in stages. The first segment was built to Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia. And that segment was completed in, I think it was 1818. And on to Illinois in by 1837. Notice that this route bypassed Pittsburgh. So part of it was Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin wanting it to go through Washington, PA. Was the reason, and also just in terms of geography, that Pittsburgh would have been a little bit out of the way for westward migration. So Pittsburgh wasn't on that route, and you can see that that route started in Baltimore. So Baltimore was the big beneficiary. Likewise, what really changed things after that was the Erie Canal, which was built from 1817 to 1825 to connect to the Hudson to New York. So now New York City had the water route to the Great Lakes, New York City had the water route to the frontier, and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were both out of the way. Needless to say, that shift to the prominence of New York was permanent at that point. So anyway, so just going back for a minute to the Braddock's Road, that went to Pittsburgh, but you can see here's where the Cumberland Road, or the National Road, went to Washington, PA, and not to Pittsburgh. Now, being the first federally funded road, it also meant that some of the the expensive bridges that the federal government could afford, but otherwise, the Western Pennsylvanians could not afford, were built. With one of them being the Great Crossings Bridge, and this is where where the National Road crosses the Youghiogheny River. Today is the Youghiogheny Lake. And another is the Dunlaps Creek Bridge in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. So first, the Great Crossings Bridge. So it was, this 3-span arch, 375 feet long, was the largest, most expensive national road bridge in Pennsylvania. I mean, the President Monroe dedicated this bridge, completing this segment of the National Road. Now, the bridge is still here. I took this picture, I think it was in 1999. But this up here, this is the water level of the lake. So when they built the Allegheny River Lake, they inundated the bridge. So when when it's really dry, usually in like November, around Thanksgiving is usually the lowest month, has the lowest lake levels of the year, the bridge sometimes reappears. The other really important bridge is the Dunlaps Creek Bridge in Brownsville. Now, James Finley did build a suspension bridge over Dunlaps Creek in 1809, but it collapsed in 1820. Why is that interesting? Because the National Road was completed in 1818. So clearly his bridge was carrying a lot more traffic than it was expected. By the way, originally the National Road did not have a bridge over the Monongahela River. They extended kind of earth and fill through the river to make like a low water crossing or a glorified ford that they had to maintain every year until eventually they built a covered bridge. But anyway, since Finley's bridge predated the National Road, and then after it collapsed, they just built a covered bridge there. Technically, this bridge was not part of the National Road. Now, after the Andrew Jackson administration came into power with the emphasis on decentralization, the federal government no longer thought that they should be owning a road or maintaining a road, and that the states should have the road. So the agreement ended up being that if the federal government paid to improve the road, then Pennsylvania could take it over and operate it as a toll road. So the federal government now in the 1830s was responsible for building a bridge. They could afford to build a cast iron bridge. So they built the first one in America. And amazingly, this bridge is still here. Mm. And it wasn't that Captain Richard Delafield of the Army wanted to just build a cast iron bridge. He wanted to build an unprecedented bridge. He wanted to build it unique and different than what was going on in Europe. So he had experience with steamboats. So he created the cylindrical segments that kind of reminded, that were inspired, by, the chambers and steamships. And again, with the need of building bridges over the frontier, rather than casting a large arch like it would have been in Europe, if you have a big screen, you might be able to see a joint right here or bolts right here and bolts right here. But what he decided to do was create standardized segments of an arch. So in that way, they could be manufactured and brought to a bridge site and erected. So the thought was that you could make this new type of iron bridge and you could replicate it and build, just kind of like what Thomas Paine thought, and build the same type of bridge over and over and over. However, this was still at a time where iron was too expensive, and the places where you could cast iron were too limited, that very few cast iron arch bridges were ever built in America. But interestingly, Brownsville still has the first iron arch bridge in America, and you can still drive across it, and hopefully they'll restore it. Interestingly, this image up top here, this is of the updated Sunderland Bridge that was the one that originally used Thomas Paine's arch. And you can very clearly see how this bridge looked, the renovated Sunderland Bridge looked very similar to the Dunlaps Creek Bridge. Yes. So since Pennsylvania was losing out to the National Road and Erie Canal, in the 1820s and early 1830s, the main line of public works, a collection of canals and primitive, say, non-locomotive railroads, were built to connect Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. However, and part of it was at the agitation of Pittsburgh, but unfortunately for the city, surveyors determined that the canal had to go on the north side of the Allegheny rather than the south side. So a wooden canal aqueduct was built at 11th Street, near pretty much where the convention center is now. So it was originally a wooden covered bridge, but there were frequent maintenance problems with the bridge. Likewise, the Pennsylvania Canal was never that much of a success. And even though it was state funded, once this bridge had enough issues where like a pier was settling and the bridge was leaking, that the canal couldn't, the state could not finance fixing the bridge. So the agreement was that the city of Pittsburgh could fix the bridge and use it as a toll bridge, or charge tolls for the canal boats to go across. So they needed to build a bridge as quickly, as cheaply as possible. And John Roebling was the right man for the job. I talked about him before, so I'm not going to go into very much detail. And Roebling could be an entire talk for another time. But the short end of it is he devised a way of creating wire rope, and he began using it on the inclines on the Portage Railroad. But he really wanted to design suspension bridges. He studied the works of James Finley, among others, in Germany, and right around one of the things that inspired him, or that inspired bridge building at the time, is when he was young, they opened, about 1820, they had opened a new cable-supported bridge, and in the opening ceremonies of the bridge, it collapsed. So the government there was not going to look at any sort of suspended structure, even though that intrigued Roebling. So that helped him want to come to the New World and build suspension bridges. So for Roebling, he was at the right time, in the right place at the right time, working on the canal, manufacturing, devising wire rope. So he said that he could very quickly and simply and cheaply build a suspension bridge with his wire rope at the Allegheny Aqueduct site. And he did. He built it on time, on budget, and the bridge was successful. While that bridge does not survive, and this is a drawing of it, and this is his aqueduct over the Delaware River, which still survives. You can see the little tops of the suspension towers are sticking up. And that bridge opened in 1845. And for Roebling, he was at the right place at the right time, as the Great Pittsburgh Fire occurred and burned the wooden-covered bridge at Smithfield Street. Even though, as you can see in this image, the piers were largely intact. So therefore, bridges were private enterprise back then, and he again said he could build a bridge more quickly and more cheaply than anything else. And so he was successful, and his first vehicular bridge was at Smithfield Street that opened in 1846, and there's an image of it. By the way, this was just the start of his career, and I know I showed this image before, but as soon as that was done, he thought, let's build this 3-part suspension bridge at the point. That sure would have been interesting had that been built. And so after building the bridges here, and by the way, this is a picture of his workshop, which still exists in Saxonburg, Butler County. He moved to Trenton because the canal was being built along the Delaware River. That's why that other aqueduct that I showed was crossing the Delaware River. So he moved to Trenton, and he began manufacturing wire rope there. And his Roebling and Sons company lasted all the way till 1953. And then it was bought and stayed in business a little while. But anyway, so while Roebling, could be hired to design bridges, and once he died in an accident building the Brooklyn Bridge, or surveying for the Brooklyn Bridge, his sons carried on the business, and either you could hire Roebling to design a bridge, or if you were designing your own bridge, you could still buy wire rope. And that starts to become the next point of the presentation, is to go from the transition of how how a lot of the bridges in Western Pennsylvania were built. So there were a lot of various suspension bridges. Maybe they were designed by Roebling, maybe they were designed by somebody else, but they used Roebling's cables. Like, for example, there's a bridge in Morgantown over the Monongahela. That's an example. A lot of bridges over the Allegheny. Roebling did come back to design one more bridge in Pittsburgh, which was this replacement for the 6th Street Bridge. So while Roebling didn't build the first 2 bridges in Pittsburgh, he built the second 2. So after the age of the canals, the railroads really started to define what bridges needed to be. they needed new technology and used more durable materials. A loss of a wagon when a Finley's iron chain bridge collapse is sad, but the loss of a fully loaded train is, and everybody aboard is devastating. So really the advent of the railroads were what really created civil engineering, as bridge designs needed to become based on analytical methods because they could not fail, and materials needed to be tested. So they really were the drivers in bridge technology. This, by the way, is the second Fort Wayne Bridge. So meanwhile, in 1865, so you have two important people in the railroad industry that decide, we could have money in bridge building because we see how railroads are really going to need to go from the original, say, wooden railroad bridges or the very costly stone bridges. They really saw the advantages of getting into the iron bridge building industry so they could supply the railroads and fuel their growth. So in 1865, Andrew Carnegie and Jacob Linville formed the Keystone Bridge Company, which is one of the most important bridge companies in America. And of course, it was formed in Pittsburgh and Lawrenceville. So starting in 1859, Carnegie was a superintendent for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he started a few years later investing in an iron mill. And so in forming this company with Linville, the iron mills could manufacture the material for bridges. So here's an image of the Union Iron Mills, which were created in 1865 in Lawrenceville. And then in 1870, the Cloman, Carnegie and Company manufacturing facility was built. Now, Linville, in 1859, he rose to be one of the resident engineers of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so now he was in charge of building bridges. And he built his first one in 1861 as a metal bridge in Philadelphia. But the need of improving metal technology to do that meant that he patented his own truss type. In 1865, as the Pennsylvania Railroad is looking to expand their lines through the Pittsburgh area, Linville's hired to build bridges over the Ohio River in Steubenville, and the Monongahela in Pittsburgh is in the Panhandle Bridge today, what is now the Panhandle Bridge today. So working together, they could now have this company to design bridges and design the demand for the iron and then steel. And then in 1872, he invented the Keystone column, which helped transition away from cast iron entirely. And then, also around that time, the company started to get into steel. So on the left here is an image of the Keystone Bridge Company here's 52nd Street and Butler Street. So you can see the Keystone Bridge Company. Here's the Lucy Furnace. And here's an image of the Lucy Furnace right here. And here are some of the Keystone bridges that were built. Here's the original Panhandle Bridge over the Monongahela. And you can see how big and thick this cast iron was. And here's the Panhandle Bridge over the Ohio River in Steubenville. Now, I mentioned this in the last presentation, but these two spans of the bridge were moved to Pittsburgh to span the Woods Run Valley on California Avenue in 1889. Now, what was really significant about what they did with these two bridges is that there was nothing else like these bridges in America at the time. This 320-foot span of the Ohio River Bridge, it's maybe small for today, but back then that was the first long span truss bridge, metal long span truss bridge built. So as another engineer noted, the era of long span truss bridges has begun. So being such an important and innovative company, the Keystone Bridge Company led the transition from building wood and metal combination bridges to cast iron bridges to wrought iron bridges to steel bridges. Now, cast iron is a strong material in compression, but it's a very weak material in tension. So it could be very brittle. So originally cast iron was only used for members of a bridge that would be in compression. So here's the plan for the Ohio River Bridge at Steubenville. You can see just how much material went into the castings. This is a different bridge that the Keystone Bridge Company did, but again, you can see all this thick cast iron members. So moving forward, the company was able to replace cast iron with wrought iron by, if you look how these were kind of in column shapes, the company started to assemble wrought iron together to form columns. So you can see how you have various circular pieces of wrought iron riveted together. And that was the Keystone column. And this bridge here was the Meade Avenue Bridge in Crawford County in Meadville with the Union Iron Works stamp on it. That bridge was built in 1871 and is currently in storage. And this bridge here, another example of their work, again over a railroad, was the old Marshall Avenue Bridge, or Island Avenue was known at the time, on the north side. And if you zoom in on the left, you can see the openings in the Keystone columns with the guy standing on the bridge. So that just showed how different companies were really competing to create these new innovative shapes in bridge construction. And the Keystone Bridge Company became really famous in the 1870s, 1874, when they completed the Eads Bridge in St. Louis. Linville was advised on the bridge and helped shape the design, but ultimately had some disputes, so he is not credited with the bridge. But the Keystone Bridge Company completed not only the first bridge over the lower, say the lower or mid Mississippi River, but also the first major steel bridge in America. So it was a very important company. Now the Smithfield Street Bridge here wasn't, it wasn't designed by the Keystone Bridge Company, but in the I-bars you can see the Cloman Patent Process 1881 stamp, where the Cloman steel from the Keystone Bridge Works was used in the Smithfield Street Bridge. And of course, it also being one of the pioneering steel bridges as well. Now, so at this time, so say now going back to the post-war period, or really the 1800s, most of the bridges were toll bridges, where individuals would form companies to build toll bridges that have to petition the government and receive a charter to build a bridge in a specific location. And at first, maybe the government might help with the investment, but that really only lasted until the 1840s. And after that, if the bridge couldn't be financially supported, self-supporting, it wouldn't be built. And so this is an example of Gustav Lindenthal's 7th Street Bridge with the toll house at the end of the bridge and the toll taker. So as these private companies needed bridges, they competed on many things, including price. Likewise, as governments towards the late 1800s started to build bridges, maybe especially in areas where a private company wouldn't be profitable, again, they would put out what they wanted in a bridge, and different companies would compete. So these companies would do all the design and the fabrication themselves. So it wasn't like today where there wouldn't be, say, uniform quality standards. But a few of these companies, a few of the country's bridge building companies were based in Pittsburgh. We'll start with the Pittsburgh Bridge Company. So it was a very prolific regional manufacturer, and there are still some examples of their work. This bridge was the Dorrington Road Bridge, which you can see built by the Pittsburgh Bridge Company in 1888. This is Noblestown Road, and it's near I-79 in Carnegie. The bridge no longer exists, but it's an example of their work. There's really not a lot of information about specifically when they started, but it was I believe it was sometime in the 1870s. However, in 1883, they hired agents, Thomas Nelson and Andrew Buchanan, and they were hired to go to the various toll companies and to go to the various counties to market the company's bridges. They were so successful, Thomas Nelson eventually became president. And the company lasted until 1900, which, like the Keystone Bridge Company, they were absorbed into American Bridge. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so at this time, this was kind of the age of the catalog bridges, where here's an image, various images from the Pittsburgh Bridge Company, but you could see how you could flip through a catalog and it would show you the various types of bridge that they would build. So depending on what you wanted or what you needed, you could order the catalog bridge. And again, these bridges often were made from a lot of small pieces put together. So in the late 1800s, before, it's amazing to think about transporting a bridge like this in a wagon, but that's exactly what happened. The parts would be prefabricated in Pittsburgh. The bridge would be transported, to where it was needed, and then workers could quickly put together the bridge, and just sometimes in a matter of days or weeks, and just stick pins at every point. And so hot riveting wasn't needed in smaller locations, and they could build their bridges. And some of the later examples, and their companies also had very distinctive details. So for example, with the Pittsburgh Bridge Company, you could tell what their bridge looked like with this portal design that has this trapezoid in the middle. This bridge used to be over the Clarion River. This bridge, if you go to Raccoon Creek State Park, is, it's closed, but it's still in that general area. And you can see they have the exact same portal design. So these companies competed in a lot of different ways. And a lot of times the bridges had various unique details. Another important Western Pennsylvania company was the Penn Bridge Company. It started in the 1860s in New Brighton and moved to Beaver Falls. And so they built, they designed and built bridges. And by, say, the turn of the century, once American Bridge and other companies got really big, as well as government started to create departments of transportation and have their own in-house designers, companies like Penn Bridge either went out of business or they became contractors and just built them, didn't design them, but just built them. But anyway, Penn Bridge Company designed probably more than any other company, designed a lot of the major bridges in our area in the 1890s. So this is the old Glenwood Bridge here, if you recall that one. And they did the Glenwood Bridge, they did the Browns Bridge, they did the Rankin Bridge, Mon City Bridge, Denora, Charleroi. So they did a lot of bridges. The Allegheny, they did the Ford City Bridge. So by 1908, this company designed, this company designed 11 bridges, and they lasted until 1936. One of the things I mentioned with competing on details is they had this very unique design where the top of the bridge would extend past the diagonal members and have these two hinges. So this bridge still exists in Cole Center in Washington County along the Monongahela. And this bridge is from the 1870s, is Watts Mill in Beaver County. And this bridge is currently in Michigan for restoration by a specialty contractor known as Box Steel that still can bring these older structures back to life, and they do historically accurate bridge renovation. But this is just one example how all of the different companies had their own little ways of competing or their own proprietary technologies. Another thing interesting about Penn Bridge Company is they probably built the nicest signs to let everybody know they built it. So here's the 1871 example of the Penn Bridge Works sign. Here's an 1884 example, and then here's an 1897 example. So you knew it was a Penn Bridge Company bridge with this fancy plaque. And on the left is the former Denora Webster Bridge. If you remember the Glenwood Bridge or the Ford City Bridge that just kind of had this specific design, those were all the Penn Bridge Company bridges. And on the right is an older example. This is the 1884 Falston Bridge in Beaver County, just north of Beaver. This bridge is closed to traffic, but it's still there. So when did the government start getting involved? Allegheny City created their Public Works Department in 1878, City of Pittsburgh in 1887. So it was really in the 1890s that they started either designing their bridges or working with other companies to fabricate their bridges. So this is the Brady Street Bridge. This was the Pittsburgh's first bridge that the Public Works Department did over one of our rivers, even though it was fabricated by the Keystone Bridge Works. In 1895, the Allegheny County created their Public Works Department, and this is the former Halton Bridge from 1910. That was their first example. And I believe that one was fabricated by the Fort Pitt Bridge Works. And in 1903, the Pennsylvania Department of Highways was formed. They designated state highways in 1911. Now they're known as PennDOT, but the state started designing bridges. So, so if you look at the way things progressed, eventually the municipal governments would have their engineering departments. They could ensure that bridges would be built to their standards. They could separate designers and builders. So in that way, the builders, it would be harder for the builders to cut corners because the bridge design would be its own entity. So the government would work with the consulting engineers to create the best possible bridge design, and then it would be up to the contractors to build that design to that standard. So that's kind of how you progressed from the competing private companies to the system that we have now. Now, just one interesting note is, as contracting became separate, there was also a lot of industry consolidation. In 1900, J.P. Morgan consolidated 28 bridge building companies, because because the fewer companies that are out there, the more centralized the company can become, the more capabilities they come, and of course, the amount of competition and pricing goes down. So the American Bridge Company became the largest bridge builder by far in the world, and it still exists today. It's still based in Coriopolis. And in 1902, they became a subsidiary of U.S. Steel. As with a lot of the other major manufacturers, the ones that survived all became owned by steel companies. So kind of what Carnegie was doing with the Keystone Bridge Company back in the 1860s that the other companies didn't do, you marry the bridge builder to the steel producer. And that's another reason why it became so successful. And the town of Ambridge is the shortened form of American Bridge, and that became the company town. Here's an image of the Ambridge Bridge, which was built in the the 1920s, which still exists and of course was built by that bridge. But it's the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, the Mackinac Bridge, many, I believe the Empire State Building, many important structures were built by the company. And one of their recent projects was the San Francisco-Oakland Bay East Bay spans in San Francisco. So they're still an important company today. Now, there were a few competitors, and one of their other competitors was the McClintic Marshall Company, which was founded in 1900 by Andrew Mellon. Helped fund this startup. So that was an interesting rivalry there. And they were a competitor, and they became the largest independent manufacturer that didn't have their own merger with a steel company or their own steel company parent. And probably the most famous McClintic Marshall Bridge should be the 40th Street Bridge here, but it's probably the Golden Gate Bridge. Just an interesting note is Dr. Mao Yixing was the first PhD student from Carnegie Tech in 1919, and he worked at McClintic Marshall when he was at school. He is considered the father of modern Chinese bridge engineering. There's a statue of him at CMU, which if you walked around campus, there are not very many statues of CMU alum, if any. So these are two of his bridges in China. This bridge in Hangzhou on the left, the Shitang River Bridge, was the first major bridge in China that was built by a Chinese engineer, of course, educated in America, including Carnegie Mellon. And then another one of his major bridges was in Wuhan, was built in 1957, and at that time was the farthest downstream naked bridge of the Yangtze River. He came back to in 1982, or sorry, he returned in 1979. Here's an article from 1982 when he came back to be inducted into the National Academy of Engineering. And again, this was certainly a big deal, but it was just interesting. He noted that the importance of bridge maintenance, which he noted is lacking on some of the Pittsburgh spans. So anyway, as things progressed into the 1900s, there was a period where the governments, especially the state, the county government and the state government, got really big, where rather than hiring consulting engineers, the governments would employ their own engineers that would design bridges in-house. Pennsylvania created their highway department in 1917, and they started creating their own bridge designs. And the goal of the department was to make things as efficient as possible, where you can create a few designs and build that exact same bridge or a very similar version of that bridge all across the state. So you need a bridge that for this condition, well, you can just pull the plan book and adapt this one. The first bridge that they designed, believe it or not, was over the Allegheny River in Coudersport. So here's this in 1917. So this bridge, this is the second crossing of the Allegheny River. So later on, their concrete bridges, they built arch bridges, beam bridges, truss bridges. This is Valley Brook Road in Washington County. This is over. This is right around Monroeville, and this kind of 1930s Art Deco style concrete bridge railing is a sure giveaway of state bridge design. So, especially in the 1930s, the Department of Highways got really big. So, all throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, just standard design bridge over standard design bridge. You can see here's a few truss bridges built in the 1930s over the Beaver River in Beaver, in Vandergrift, over the Kiski River, the Allegheny River in Parker, and the Conemaugh River outside of Johnstown. So you can see these variations. Hundreds and hundreds, well, actually, hundreds and hundreds of truss bridges and thousands of state design bridges were built all over this. Were built all over. After, eventually, consultants were hired, and bridge design became more of an individual project. Though with the recent rapid bridge replacement project, that went back to kind of a public-private partnership and standardizing bridge designs once again. So the Beechwood Boulevard Bridge, between Greenfield and Shenley Park and Squirrel Hill, is an example, one of the more exciting examples of modern bridges today, in which, again, where the local government hires an engineering consultant. In this case, the company was HDR, to design and build a bridge to their specifications. So, that's generally where modern construction goes. And with that, it's 8:30, so I'll be happy to entertain any questions, and I'll leave this image up, which is a map of all of the bridges in the city of Pittsburgh.
Okay, Todd, do you have any updates on the concrete bridge over Commercial Street replacement? I've heard some horror stories about how long that's going to take. And
yeah, so I'm not specifically involved in that project. So, anything that I know about it is just through the All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. All right, thanks. Since I'm not specifically involved in that project, I don't know a lot of the intricacies, but I know they were exploring ideas of building, either building a bridge next to it or building a bridge that could be slid into place. And there's also questions in a public process about shaping the design of the bridge, whether or not it would be an arch bridge or say, a frame bridge like the Murray Avenue Bridge. It sounded like that was a design they were interested in. So we'll see. But certainly the goal for them would be to be able to minimize traffic disruptions. And I heard they would like to explore the opportunity of building a new bridge alongside, closing the parkway for a week or two, and sliding the new bridge in place. And such moves, have bridges sliding to place have happened for for over 100 years. The Fort Wayne Railroad Bridge was built like that, and they just built a bridge over the Ohio River like that. So it is a not a common way of doing it, but it's definitely a way that can be done.
So Todd, I've got a question. It's Charlie Stewart.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Charlie.
So we've talked about the replacement of the Heth's Run Bridge on Butler Street. That was in 2014, and the Halton Bridge in Oakmont, that was 2016.
Mm-hmm.
The South Highland Avenue Bridge that was replaced 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Greenfield Bridge was a couple of years ago. What's next on the horizon, do you think, for bridge replacement or maintenance?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I just to say, just in general, the way that projects are funded, and the way that design standards are, they generally tend to favor replacement of bridges. But if a structure is, say, large or in an area that's really difficult to replace, like maybe there's constrained right-of-way, or it's an iconic structure, then they're a lot more likely to, to just rehabilitate that structure. So, new bridges need, it may sound funny to say that the goal of a new bridge is to make it appear that you're not driving across a bridge, but part of that is for a reason, with having wide shoulders, strong concrete barriers to minimize any potential, issues with modern traffic and modern trucks using a bridge. So yeah, so I think that the, as mentioned, probably the next big project is, the Parkway's, Commercial Street Viaduct, and potentially other bridges along, the Parkway that were built in the 40s and 50s. And if the Monfayette is ever built, there would be a major project over the river, by Kennywood as well as over Turtle Creek. So PennDOT maintains a website, kind of a GIS map where you can, where all of their projects that are planned within the next several years are listed. So that's probably the best source if there's any particular structure you're wondering about.
Todd, how would you characterize the state of bridges in the region? Are they in dire need of repair? Or are they in good condition? And what can be done to improve the conditions of the bridges?
Well, maintenance, and maintenance, right? As Mao Yixing said, that maintenance is the most important thing, but there's a lot of issues between various owners and various funders. So we're in a system where generally the city, county, or state is owning the bridge, but for major projects, usually the money, or the majority of the money, comes from the federal government. So it's, and of course there's also the question, is it better to maintain an old bridge, or is it better to build a new bridge to modern, safer design standards? If you're familiar with East Liverpool, Ohio, it's a good example. There are two bridges, the 1970s era US 30 bridge, which is a big wide bridge that you can drive 70 miles an hour across, and the 1905 Newell Bridge, still privately operated and is generally in really good shape. I mean, it's a narrow bridge. It might be scary to drive across, but it's because it's a private company and it's only, say, one funding source, that company knows to maximize the return on their funding that they need to maintain it well. So we just get into an interesting place of too many different owners and funding sources and standards. So things get very complicated. I mean, in general, since bridges are inspected at minimum every 2 years, and if bridges are noted to be deficient, then the cycle of inspection will improve. It will go up to maybe every year, maybe every 6 months. That it is very, very, very rare for there to be any sort of bridge failure in America. I mean, it happens occasionally, but generally the engineers are on top of at least posting a bridge or restricting a bridge if they think that it's problematic. Oh, speaking of that, one of the bridges, if you've seen, that is really in poor condition here, and I know there's an active project on, is the Charles Anderson Bridge in Shenley Park.
Todd, wasn't the Brady Street Bridge built right next to the Birmingham Bridge?
Yes, it was. Yes, in fact, I know there were various questions because they built the Birmingham Bridge piers, and the piers sat there for a while before they finished the bridge. But yes, that's an example. When they replace a bridge, they either, like Brady Street or Halton, they either build a new bridge next to it, or in the case of, say, the Beechwood Boulevard Bridge, they might tear down the old bridge and build the new bridge right in place.
I was really interested in not the bridge itself, the Manchester Bridge, which was long gone even before I came to the city. But I was reading the obituary of the owner of this fancy furniture shop that was on the edge of downtown, Hen de Jean. And in this obituary, it said that he had made a proposal to city council to buy the bridge for $1 and to create a kind of Ponte Vecchio on it, with shops and the like. And I thought that was such a neat idea, but of course that wasn't done.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's really interesting to see what goes on, throughout the region, throughout the country, and throughout the world, because there are a lot of different potential uses for old bridges. With the Manchester Bridge, one of the biggest challenges was the desire with the Renaissance planning to have the symmetrical Fort Pitt, Fort Duquesne look to the city, and the Manchester Bridge would have complicated that. But like, for example, in Massachusetts, there's an old bridge that's an old concrete bridge that they turned into the Bridge of Flowers. And so it's this kind of linear garden. And of course, the High Line was in New York City is a later example of that on an old rail line. Or in Nashville, the Shelby Street Bridge is kind of a party bridge in Nashville. And so there's a lot of, and meanwhile in Calhoun County, Michigan, a lot of the smaller bridges were moved to and restored and moved to the park, and it's a dedicated historic bridge park with about 5 different bridges. So there's a lot of, one of the interesting things I mentioned with the old bridges being portable, where they could be transported by wagon, is a lot of the old bridges are like erector sets. You can take them apart, put them together. That Watts Mill Bridge is in Beaver County, from Beaver County, is in Michigan, being restored. So there's a lot of creative things that you can do. And through current policy, where you can buy a historic bridge for $1 as long as you move it, and you might even be able to get some reimbursement funding if the cost for removal might be able to be transferred for restoring the bridge. There's a lot of unique and interesting things that can be done.
Todd, how many bridges are there in Pittsburgh? I know there are bridges and bridges, but on your map here you have river crossings, so that's the big black dot.
Yes.
How many? Well, if somebody asks you how many bridges are there in Pittsburgh, what would you say?
Well, so I'll resort to this table where it's it's really a question of how you define a bridge.
Yes.
Because if you're in the stove room in Phipps Conservatory, you walk under a bridge and then you walk on top of it, right?
Yeah.
Would you consider that a bridge? Or when you go to the aviary and you're walking in the tropical jungle and you're looking down at the birds, do you consider that a bridge in Pittsburgh? Or what about the little ones in Shenley Park? And believe it or not, in the engineering world, when you're inventorying bridges, part of the unique number assigned to each bridge is the road that crosses the bridge. And whenever you have a ramp, that ramp has a different number. So in the engineering world, ramps will often be counted as its own bridge. And if you think about like the Fort Pitt Bridge, look at how many different ramps are connected to the bridge, or say the bridge over the Mon Wharf, which is kind of a different structure despite being connected to the Fort Pitt Bridge. So there are so many different questions of, so if you consider just river bridges, say major structures like the Panther Hollow Bridge, and intermediate structures, say like a parkway overpass, that's, you know, a unique defined bridge, you can say that there's at least 370 in the city. However, if you want to, you know, count everything, and buildings, by the way, that means like a footbridge in between two buildings like you see downtown. If you want to count everything, this number will go higher than 700. So you can, whatever works for you, go with this number, and don't go by 446, because there's no way that you can specifically have a definitive number.
Thank you.
Todd,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, first of all, I find your presentation very good.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, in the very early days of Pittsburgh,
Mhm.
before there were any bridges across any rivers,
Mhm.
and there was the start of the evolution of bridges across our rivers, where did these people study the design of the bridges? Did it come from England with the iron? Where did it come from? I'm interested.
Mhm. So that's a great question. And at that time, bridge building was more of a craft. So civil engineering really didn't become you know, a discipline at all until starting like the 1830s in New York. You know, were the first universities, and New York being because of the Erie Canal. So yeah, before that, you either learned in Europe, or whether you were a self-taught engineer or you were just a builder. So if you built structures, you built buildings, you built barns, and and then different, say, bridge rights, let's call it, because I think that's what they were called. You know, bridge rights might, you know, build something based on a pattern they've seen, or put something together like a structure, and if there were problems with it, build it stronger next time. You know, originally, the old wooden structures, you know, that were, say, the simple, like, you know, put a few logs together and drive them into the river, you know, something like that would only last a few years. You know, like, say, like today, you'd think like maybe a wooden park bridge. But to actually, once you started to get these, say, the bigger covered bridges, yeah, it was really a craft. Maybe you went to, you were apprenticed to do that. So a few different ways.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Todd. Very interesting talk.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for
And
coming out on this cold February night. And hopefully it didn't snow, and there won't be any ice going down the hill to the parking lot, right?
I hope not either, yeah. Okay,
Thank you. Excellent
Yes.
presentation.
All right, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd.